Former U.S. President Donald Trump might be barred from running again for the White House. We'll explain the latest legal entanglement. Hello, I'm Mike Mueller, sitting in for Anna Naidu, and this is The Heat. Some activists and legal scholars in the U.S. are trying to prevent Donald Trump from running for president again. They are claiming the 14th Amendment denies anyone who engaged in insurrection against the Constitution after taking an oath to defend it from holding office. Will that argument hold up in court, though? In other legal troubles for Trump, a report was released in the Georgia racketeering case in which he's accused of trying to overturn the results of the 2020 presidential election. CGTN White House correspondent Nathan King has details.
This 26-page report was under seal until the indictments in the Georgia case came down. And essentially, what it says is there's far more people that could have been charged, including sitting South Carolina Senator Lindsey Graham. You may remember he actually was the first person who was on record of making calls to the Secretary of State in Georgia, Brad Raffensperger, to sort of see whether there was any fraud in the election, maybe nudging him to try and overturn the results. Now, he pushed back on this, but the grand jury recommended that he be charged in this case. Let me also read you other people that they recommended that haven't been charged as well. Michael Flynn, the short-served national security advisor to Donald Trump, the QAnon enthusiast, former senators of Georgia, David Perdue and Kelly Loeffler, both of them Republicans, other advisors as well, including Trump attorney Lynn Wood. The fact that prosecutors held back from charging these people suggests perhaps they had so many charges they thought this case would go on forever. And this is the real problem going forward, because as you know, Fannie Willis, the prosecutor, the district attorney in the case, wants to get this trial underway in just a few months. There have been appeals from extensions. Trump's lawyers want it taken out of state court and tried in federal court. Others are seeking separate trials from the 19 in total. So it's all a bit of a mess. But the real message from this report is that the grand jury felt they had multiple amounts of evidence. This strengthens the case in a way for the prosecution, because they can show they really sifted through what the grand jury, these people who judged the case on its merits before these indictments were laid down. And it's not good news for Trump and his team. Now, even if it is moved, by the way, to federal court, it's still under Georgia state law. And that means if Trump is convicted, or any others, they would not be able to be pardoned at the presidential level. Nathan King, CGTN, outside the White House.
Well, we certainly have a lot to talk about. Let's bring in our panelists here in our studio. We persuaded him to leave his attic and join us. Thank you so much for doing that. Adolfo Franco.
Mike.
He's an attorney and Republican strategist. Joseph Williams is former senior editor for the U.S. News and World Report. He joins us here in Washington, D.C. Also here in D.C., Frank Sesno, Director of Strategic Initiatives at George Washington University School of Media and Public Affairs, and a former CNN Washington bureau chief. And from St. Petersburg in Florida, Jeffrey Schwartz is a law professor at Western Michigan University's Cooley Law School. I want to welcome all of you to the show, and I want to start with you, Jeffrey, because maybe you can make sense of all of this for us. We topped the show by talking about the 14th Amendment. We've got an international audience, so I don't want to get too deep into the weeds, but try and explain it to them how this works. There's been a lot of talk about the specific clause, Section 3, to this amendment as it pertains to Trump. And of course, we know that some voters in the state of Colorado have gone to court. They filed a suit to keep Trump off the ballot because of the 14th Amendment there.
Okay, the first thing for the international audience is to understand the 14th Amendment came after the insurrection of the 1960s. Most people call it the Civil War. It was meant to keep people who had been senators or congressmen in 1860 and then went to the South and served the South as leaders of that insurrection from taking their place back either in the Senate or the House or as governors or as congressmen or as state representatives in their state at home. It is a very straightforward, plain amendment that even under an interpretation by the Supreme Court, who are textualists, they would have to find that it would be applicable to conduct even now that is considered to be insurrectionist or rebellious. In this particular case, this is just the first of what will be many attempts to take Mr. Trump off of the ballot. Normally, citizens aren't allowed to sue the federal government and or involve themselves in a federal question. So what they did is they sued the Secretary of State out in Colorado, seeking a writ of mandamus or a requirement that she take such action on the Colorado ballot and remove Mr. Trump from the ballot for President of the United States. This is just the first of many. I anticipate that, for example, the Secretary of State in Michigan will take exactly the same kind of action. And it's a kind of a self-executing thing. It doesn't require that anybody be convicted of anything. It doesn't require anything more than that a Secretary of State believes that they have acted in a rebellious or insurrectionist way. Yes, there is judicial review, but that would be after that Secretary of State has acted. And I think that's kind of the way it's going to work.
All right. And Adolfo, I want to get you to chime in on this. President Trump responded to this forcefully. We don't know him to respond any other way, right? So he went on Truth Social. We've got his quote up there. We're going to put it on the screen. And he says almost all legal scholars have voiced opinions that the 14th Amendment has no legal basis or standing relative to the upcoming 2024 presidential election. He calls it a trick, an effort basically to steal the election. Of course, it's worth pointing out, though, that Michael Ludick, who's a former conservative judge, and Lawrence Tribe, an esteemed constitutional law professor, both wrote an article in The Atlantic. I'm sure you read it. Everybody else did. And the headline was, "The Constitution prohibits Trump from ever being elected president again." So I want to get you to weigh in and give us, you're an attorney. Where do you see this?
Well, first of all, the two authors are the most noted anti-Trumpers in Washington, D.C., both of them. Just because you are a Republican doesn't mean you can't be a never-Trumper, and he certainly is, Ludwig is. So I discount that partisan piece totally. You know, one of the rare times I agree with Jeffrey on a little point here, this 14th Amendment and the clause, which doesn't mention the president, by the way, that has to do entirely with the Civil War. And that was an amendment that was put into place to address the Civil War and to make sure that what had been a Civil War that almost divided the country, that those individuals that were involved in the Civil War not return to power. That was its purpose. That was the intent. Now, a couple of things to clarify here. President Trump has never been charged, even by all these Democrat partisans, including the Democrat DOJ, because these are all being directed by Merrick Garland. All of these accusations have never included, or the allegations that have been put forward, anything on insurrection and anything on sedition. None of it. Now, there was one exception, and that was the second impeachment of President Trump, which that was the proper form. The Congress of the United States was impeachment, even though it was after the fact, and we all know it was ludicrous and absurd, but that was on the January 6th so-called insurrection. He was acquitted by the United States Senate. There is no accusation of this, so this is another round of how do we keep this man off the ballot, okay? And of course, the Colorado case that Jeffrey is referring to, this was in hand. The Colorado Secretary of State, who's a Democrat, engineered this to make sure that this is something that, as absolutely he's right, is going to be forced her to be sued and then respond on this with a view to keep him off the ballot. What this tells you is simply this. There's a legal maneuver here going on, or a thesis doing, to frustrate what the will of the American people is. The best thing, and I know we'll get to the politics of this, is, you know, CNN, not exactly, we have Frank Sesno here, I want him to comment on this.
He's up next.
CNN just released a poll, shows President Trump today ahead of Joe Biden and Nikki Haley by 6, but President Trump ahead. So what are they going to do next? To clarify what Nathan King was saying on this, they should have just, the reason they indict these individuals is because it's so obvious that this is political, but I guess now we have crossed the Rubicon in America where political free speech, the First Amendment rights of politicians such as Senator Perdue, could be indicted. So this is what the game is, to try to frustrate the will of the American people.
Okay, you mentioned Frank. I'm going to invite him in next. Frank, it's worth noting that a state judge did use the language to disqualify a court commissioner who was elected in New Mexico because he was convicted in a January 6th case. But to Adolfo's point, there's other liberal groups that are going to states like Florida, New Hampshire, New Mexico, Ohio, Wisconsin, urging that Trump's name not be put on the ballot. But I would think that Adolfo would agree with me here that, if you want to vote for Trump, his name doesn't need to be on the ballot. You can write in his name. Is it really going to hurt him in any way? Where do you see this going?
Oh, boy. Does it hurt him to take him off the ballot? Yeah, you turn him into a write-in candidate. That just makes it complicated. It becomes, and a lot of people will say this, certainly Trump advocates and allies, that's election interference, right? You're trying to deprive people of the easy opportunity to cast their ballot for Donald Trump. The Trump, foes are all for that. I mean, look, this is very, where do we see it going? I don't know where this is going. I don't think anybody knows where this is going. The language in Section 3 of the 14th Amendment says that any person who shall have engaged in insurrection or rebellion. The problem is, who makes that judgment? At this point, as was just pointed out, no one has made that judgment. There's a strong opinion on it. There are cases pending that may get there, but we're nowhere close. So what this is doing in the short term is bolstering Trump's narrative that he has used against every one of the other cases that has been brought against him, that this is part of a witch hunt, that this is part of being politically persecuted. And it certainly, based on the polls and other things that we are seeing, is working, and not just among his most loyal base. It's working amongst enough people so that, as you point out, in a head-to-head race, here we are still a year plus away from the general election, in a hypothetical general election against Joe Biden, an incumbent president, Trump is neck and neck, or maybe a little ahead.
But the Congress did act on this. The Congress did acquit.
I think he's talking about adjudicating.
But I mean,
let me move on to Joseph just for a second. Georgia's Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger, who made headlines, of course, after this taped phone call with Trump, where Trump asked him to find another 11,780 votes, I believe it was. He's making the argument in the Wall Street Journal against the 14th Amendment. He says that, this is going to add to this narrative for people who feel aggrieved that everything's rigged, the system's rigged against them. And he said, why don't we just trust the American voters? Is he making a point?
And it's hard to disagree with the fact that this feeds into Trump's narrative. I mean, I agree with what Frank Sesno said, is that this is working against people who believe that Trump is disqualified to run for office. I think part of the problem is that we are in uncharted waters here. Nobody really knows who's going to be the arbiter of this. Even if these courts go to these cases go to court and get tried criminally ahead of the election, what happens then? I mean, President Trump is likely to appeal and is likely to remain on bond pending appeal. So we still have the same kind of mess that we're in right now, only with extra steps. So I think what has to happen is an election where the public decides who they want to be president, and then let the legal cases fall where they may. I mean, as unfortunate as it is, and I mean, most of us on this panel saw what happened on January 6th, and by our own logic and conclusions can kind of infer that there was some role that President Trump played in all of this. It's going to be really, really challenging to sort all of this out, because democracy is basically run on trust. I mean, it's like a pickup basketball game where you call your own fouls. There's no referee, there's no enforcer. Even if Trump was to be removed from the ballot, who makes that decision, and how does that get enforced if people decide no, if you have a Secretary of State who says, no, I'm not going to remove him from the ballot. So we're in uncharted waters here. It's a straight, amazing test of our democracy, and quite frankly, it's hard to know whether or not it's going to pass.
Frank, let me ask you about a USA Today poll which is out this week, which asked voters who say they're not going to vote why, and so many of them say that my vote doesn't count, the whole system's rigged. This gets back to this whole kind of like everything's rigged. And it's interesting because this is a problem in the United States, and it's a narrative that you talked about with Trump, but it's a narrative that I would say goes all the way back to 2000. I mean, and it's not just Republicans. I mean, Democrats back then in Bush versus Gore felt like, it was these justices in black robes that decided that election. And then, of course, when Hillary lost, you heard about Russian interference. And then when Trump loses, it's the whole thing's rigged. There's a big problem in the United States, isn't there, about trust in elections?
Oh, there's a huge problem in the United States about trust in elections and trust in our institutions. It goes beyond elections. It's now spilled over to the Supreme Court because everything has been politicized. And I agree with you that this goes back in some ways to 2000, but 2000 was very different because when the Supreme Court ultimately made its decision, Al Gore conceded. And both Al Gore and George W. Bush, you would have to say, were institutionalists. They believed in the institutions. The gloves were off. The fight was real. That's not new. We've had that before. What's different now, and it's very substantially different, is we have people in very prominent places, in very significant positions of power, to include a former president, current candidate, who fundamentally is challenging the integrity of our institutions. That's amplified through our media and social media. So this distrust that you talk about is very deep. If I may, we did a focus group at the university the other day with young people, college-age students, both parties. The first question was one word to describe our democracy. Not one young person, Republican or Democrat, had a positive word. There were words like broken, crooked, bought. I mean, the sense of the sort of negative doom that so many people are seeing with respect to this democracy is a very, very serious problem. It's going to take a long time to fix.
And Adolfo, I know you've been involved in politics for a long time, and you've seen this kind of unraveling. And as I pointed out, as Democrats and Republicans who've complained in recent elections, how do you get the genie back in the bottle?
I'm not sure you do. I really don't. I think the country is being transformed, and I lay the blame squarely on the Democrat Party because they have done something different that's never been done before. And the view of I think, the majority of the American people is weaponize now the system and a two-tier justice system. But going back to the elections and distrust, to Frank's point, this isn't President Trump. Did Stacey Abrams win the governor's race? She's got on television. She was on the short list for vice president. She got on television and said, I won after being certified. She challenged the election, then put money into a phony group. She's not being charged with anything, contesting a certified election. Hillary Clinton said after the fact that President Trump was illegitimate president, then she won the election. Democrat after Democrat, you can run through this on a tape here, going back and forth saying the illegitimacy of the Trump election, and that he's an illegitimate president. So you can't have it. You can't have it both ways. There's major distrust because the system has failed us in many ways. The system has failed us in the sense that I think there are not sufficient controls on our ballots and the systems, that there's not enough faith in the system as it is today, and it has certainly been a bipartisan problem.
Jeff, I want to get your thoughts.
Yeah, really. The first thing I can say is that what Adolfo is saying is clearly the Republican thought process to destroy democracy and install Donald Trump as a dictator. There's no question about it. He ignores what happened and he blames everything on the Democrats. Donald Trump, who wants to suspend the Constitution, is the guy that should be sitting in the White House. That's just offensive to anybody who believes in the Constitution. I think the thought process that people think only about 1/6 and think that's all there was to an insurrection or a rebellion against the United States government is just inaccurate. All you have to do to look at what really happened is take a look at the indictment that is pending in Washington that shows that, in fact, the actions to try to overthrow our government were not just on January 6th. They started even before the November 3rd election. There were actions being taken to secure, even though Donald Trump lost, how he was going to hold on to the presidency. And Adolfo should know better. He's a lawyer. He studied the Constitution, and yet he sits there and says, let's overthrow the Constitution and put Donald Trump back into the White House to do what he has promised to do. That is, go after his enemies, try to jail people, and to overturn the Constitution in every way, shape, and form that he possibly can.
All right, Jeff. Let me give
Adolfo
let me give Adolfo a chance to respond.
Now you just heard the totalitarian left that should frighten every single American. When you have a different point of view, which I am now an advocate for a dictatorship, I'm now an advocate for. Now let me finish. I let you finish. There you have the totalitarian leftist view of this country. There is an indictment. This so-called professor is calling an indictment a fact.
I'm not a so-called
and anybody can be
I'm
indicted.
a professional.
And anybody
is a professor.
It's
not a so-called
professor. And anybody that says an adjunct can be a professor.
That's enough of that. I am one.
This individual calls an indictment a fact. You read the indictment. Indictment is an accusation. Indictment is not a conclusion of anything. He's calling a riot on January 6th, where President Trump, 2 days prior, offered 10,000 troops to protect the Capitol. He's calling that an insurrection that the president was conspiring to doing. He offered it, and two Democratic leaders, Pelosi and Mayor Bowser of Washington, D.C., rejected it. That's some heck of an insurrection that's involved. What they don't want to hear is another side that says there were irregularities in the election, there's an absolute right to contest the election, there's an absolute right to use all the mechanisms available, which he was using, as the Democrat Stacey Abrams herself has done.
All right.
So you can't.
Okay, we've got your point.
You can't have this. This Jeffrey should work for Pravda, or the old Pravda. This is the type of.
Now I do want to kind of move on, but Jeff, I'll give you a chance to respond just quickly, if you will.
With the Republican Party, you are not what's right with the Republican Party. You're everything that's wrong.
Well, the majority of American people seem to have my view, not yours, Jeff.
Let's move on to the Democratic Party. Joseph, let's kind of shift our focus. The leading candidate, of course, the incumbent president. Recent CNN poll showing a majority of Democratic voters would rather have a different candidate than Joe Biden. What do you make of the weak polling numbers for Joe Biden?
I make of it that it's pretty obvious. I mean, people don't believe that he's been a forceful advocate for their point of view. People don't believe he's been a dynamic leader in the White House. And people believe, frankly, that he's too old to run for president for a third term. I mean, those are beliefs and those are things that people feel. But at the end of the day, he's the horse that you got to ride if you're a Democrat into the election. I mean, there's no other choice. And I don't think people want him so weakened by a primary fight that he is unable to defeat whoever the Republicans nominate in 2024. I mean, it's really unfortunate because I think Biden has kind of tried to do the right thing by most parties. He's tried to do he's tried to keep his vow about returning the country to normalcy, but unfortunately, after 4 years of chaos and impulsive decisions, we kind of have gotten used to or inured to that kind of dynamism. And so I think part of that is the fact that we don't really have the election in front of us right now. If we did, I think people would galvanize around their positions. I think people would stand behind President Biden. I think they will ultimately, mainly because we're almost a year away from the election and we don't really have any alternatives. The Democrats rather don't really have any alternatives compared to what the Republicans might put up. And even then, we don't know who the nominee is going to be. And so Frank, I think that that's very important.
Frank, let me talk to you about another poll, Wall Street Journal out with a poll, which shows that when it comes to Biden and Trump, favorability ratings for both of them right around 39%. Neither party has to be very happy about that.
Right. This is not an inspiring rematch. It's not inspiring voters. And to the point that Joseph was just making, Joe Biden hasn't been particularly effective. Look, this is something I think we have to recognize because it helps us really understand what's going on here. Joe Biden has never had a strong base. There is not a powerful Biden movement out there. Joe Biden is president because there was an anti-Trump vote. It was not so much a pro-Biden vote. There was a pro-Biden vote from some, obviously. But this is part of the dynamic here. And to the extent that Joe Biden has a chance of being reelected, if this in fact is a Biden-Trump reelection match, it's going to be because there's turnout to vote against Trump more than for Biden, unless he can dramatically change the environment. His communication since he came in has been spotty, sporadic. He gives few interviews. He speaks extemporaneously seldom, and when he does, he often creates these gaffes. And so there's this impression that he's kind of this doddering old man, and he is an old man. And a lot of people think he's too old for the office. So there are huge boulders for him to push. And just as he won, because he did in 2020, if he's reelected in 2024 going up against Trump, it's going to be the anti-Trump vote that gets him there, not the pro-Biden vote.
And let me ask you about Trump, because we're running out of time, and we do want to talk about his polling numbers, which continue to go up. They're not going down. If you were to take all the other candidates and mash all their numbers together, they still couldn't surpass him. Is there any scenario where you see where he doesn't get the nomination? There's still a lot of talk about, you talk about the Never Trumpers, Youngkin's name comes up, this or that.
Well, yes, there's always a possibility. I mean, there's so many people were saying that Jeb Bush was going to be president, Governor Walker of Wisconsin, and so a lot of things can happen. There's no question. And of course, the legal issues that we talked about can complicate matters in ways that I agree, are uncharted, and we have no idea what's going to happen in the next few months. But what the other guests haven't mentioned is, yes, most people think Joe Biden is too old. Most people recognize that he's cognitively challenged and the rest of it. But the polls show the problems are inflation. The problems are inflation. The polls show that inflation, the border crisis, rising crime. It's the record he has, and all that. Since you talk about the CNN polling, look at the CNN polling. 77% of the population, Democrats and Republicans, think the country's moving in the wrong direction. So here's the difference, Frank Sesno. In 2000, yes, there was maybe potentially, you could argue, people were voting against President Trump because they didn't really like Biden or they didn't know Biden. But now Biden owns a record. It's his 4 years. And his 4 years have been a dismal disaster on its facts. That's what the polling all indicates.
Frank, I've got about 30 seconds. I'll give you a chance to respond.
I think there's a lot more the polling does not reveal. I think there's a lot that's churning under the surface. And in point of fact, for a not even full one-term president, Biden has a lot to point to in legislative victories. You may not like them, but he's got them. Inflation is down, and it's so far defied the odds and the predictions that we'd end up paying for that with a recession. So there's a much bigger story here. He hasn't been very good at telling it, but there's a bigger story here.
Are you better off than you were 4 years ago? That's the message.
There you go.
Inflation was a heck of a lot lower 4 years ago.
We're going to have to leave it there. I'm sorry, we've run out of time. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us, and that's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Mike Mulder in Washington, D.C. Thanks for joining us. Have a great weekend.